Close your eyes and go back to 2005. The air smells like cheap body spray and anticipation. The iPhone doesn't exist. YouTube has just been born and is barely a blip. Streaming means waiting 45 minutes to watch a 3-minute pixelated video. The internet is still a frontier town. It is messy. It is loud. It is dangerous. And in this digital Wild West, there is one sheriff, one king, one God. His name is Tom, and he is your first friend, MySpace. If you weren't there, you can't understand the sheer gravity of it. It wasn't just a website. It was a digital nation-state. In 2005, MySpace had more traffic than Google. It accounted for nearly 5% of all internet visits in the United States. It was the coolest club on earth, and everyone had a membership card. It was a place of total chaotic expression. You learned HTML just to make your background sparkle. You ranked your friends in a top 8, a brutal social hierarchy that destroyed real-life relationships daily. It was a popularity contest weaponized by code. The company behind it, Intermix Media, was based in Los Angeles, and that location mattered. They weren't silicon-blooded geeks. They were Hollywood. They threw parties at the Playboy Mansion. They hung out with rock stars. They were selling a lifestyle. The CEO, Chris DeWolf, drove fast cars and wore designer denim. He looked at his creation and saw a media empire that would last 1,000 years. But while the MySpace team was popping champagne in LA, something was growing in the dark dorm rooms of Palo Alto. Something cold, something clean, something quiet. Mark Zuckerberg wasn't trying to build a nightclub. He was trying to build a directory. The Facebook was rigid. It was blue and white. No glitter, no music, no customizable backgrounds. It was a utility. And unlike MySpace, which let anyone with an email address inside, Facebook was a fortress. You needed a .edu email. It was exclusive. MySpace was the loud house party where the cops show up. Facebook was the VIP lounge where you needed a password. And Chris DeWolf? He wanted to buy the VIP lounge. He wanted to buy it, gut it, and paste a MySpace logo over the door. He didn't know it yet, but he was about to make the most expensive calculation error in the history of human commerce. Spring 2005. The tension between MySpace and Facebook is often remembered as a war, but at the time, it felt more like a giant ignoring an insect. MySpace had 20 million unique visitors. Facebook had maybe a few million college kids. But Chris DeWolf was smart enough to know that the insect was biting. He decided to squash it the American way, by throwing money at it. He invited Mark Zuckerberg and his president, Sean Parker, to Los Angeles. The meeting took place at MySpace HQ. The culture clash was instant. On one side, you had the MySpace executives, older, polished, confident, smelling of expensive cologne and success. They treated the meeting casually. Why wouldn't they? They owned the internet. On the other side, you had Zuckerberg, 20 years old, socially awkward, intense. He walked into the lion's den with a backpack and a stare that could cut glass. The negotiation started. DeWolf laid out his vision. He didn't want Facebook to run independently. He wanted to acquire it, strip it for parts, and integrate the college network into MySpace. He viewed Facebook not as a competitor, but as a feature he hadn't built yet. Finally, the pleasantries ended. The air in the room grew heavy. DeWolf looked at the kid in the hoodie and asked the only question that mattered. What's the number? What will it take for you to walk away? Zuckerberg and Parker had discussed this. They didn't really want to sell. They believed they were building something that would change the world. But everyone has a price. Zuckerberg said $75 million. $75 million. Today, that sounds like a joke. Facebook makes $75 million roughly every 3 hours. But in 2005, for a website with no revenue and a limited user base, it was a fortune. Chris DeWolf paused. He ran the numbers in his head. MySpace was currently in talks to be acquired by media giant Viacom or News Corp for hundreds of millions of dollars. $75 million was a significant chunk of change, but it was doable. It was a strategic investment. But then, the ego kicked in. DeWolf looked at Zuckerberg, he looked at the hoodie, and he decided he wasn't going to let a college dropout set the terms. He wanted a win. He wanted to show who was the alpha in the room. He countered. We won't pay $75 million. We'll pay $74 million. $1 million. That was the gap. In a deal of this magnitude, $1 million is a rounding error. It is less than the legal fees to draft the contract. It is the cost of the snacks in the break room. It is nothing. But it wasn't about the money. It was a test. DeWolf was betting that Zuckerberg was desperate. He was betting that the kid would cave just to get the deal done. He bet wrong. Mark Zuckerberg didn't negotiate. He didn't counter at $74.5 million. He simply stood up. He felt insulted. Not by the price, but by the game. To Zuckerberg, this wasn't a bazaar. This was the future of human connection. And if MySpace was going to squabble over pennies, they didn't deserve to own the future. He walked out. MySpace kept their $1 million, and they signed their own death warrant. A few months later, Chris DeWolf got his payout. Rupert Murdoch, the titan of old media, the man behind Fox News and newspapers around the world, bought MySpace for $580 million. Chris DeWolf and his team were rich. They were hailed as geniuses. They had sold at the top. But in reality, they had just handed the keys of a Ferrari to a dinosaur. News Corp didn't understand the internet. They didn't understand community. They understood one thing: extraction. They had paid $500 million and they wanted their money back immediately. The order came down from the top: monetize everything. MySpace became a digital billboard. The user experience was sacrificed on the altar of quarterly earnings. The site became slow. It became spammy. It became unsafe. It felt like walking through a bad neighborhood at 2 a.m. Profiles were hacked. Malware spread like wildfire. The cool club was becoming a dive bar with sticky floors and broken windows. And while MySpace was suffocating under the weight of corporate greed, Mark Zuckerberg was executing a masterclass in patience. He kept Facebook clean. He refused to sell banner ads for years. He focused entirely on speed, utility, and real identity. He opened Facebook to high schools, then to corporate offices, then finally to the world. People didn't just switch to Facebook, they fled to Facebook. It was white flight on a digital scale. They left the noisy, dangerous chaos of MySpace for the gated community of Facebook. In April 2008, the flip happened. Facebook overtook MySpace in unique visitors. Once the momentum shifted, it was over. In social media, when your friends leave, you leave. MySpace didn't just decline, it evaporated. The fall was brutal. In 2005, MySpace was valued at $12 billion. In 2011, News Corp, desperate to get rid of the rotting corpse of the site, sold it. They sold it for $35 million. Murdoch lost over $500 million. It remains one of the worst acquisitions in the history of media, a colossal failure of vision, management, and understanding of the product. But the real tragedy isn't what MySpace lost. It's what they could have had. Today, Meta, the parent company of Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp, is worth over $1.2 trillion. Mark Zuckerberg is one of the richest men in human history.
He rules over a digital empire that connects 3 billion people. He influences elections, economies, and culture itself. And he does it all with the company that Chris DeWolf refused to buy. Think about that spread. 74 million versus 75 million. If DeWolf had paid that extra million, if he had swallowed his pride, MySpace would have owned the social graph. They would have owned the data of the entire planet. Instead, they tried to save a rounding error, and they paid the ultimate price. In business, we often talk about strategy. We talk about market fit. But sometimes history turns on the smallest, most human of hinges. A laugh in a Blockbuster boardroom, a $1 million grudge in the Los Angeles office. Chris DeWolf thought he was negotiating a deal for a website. He didn't realize he was negotiating for the soul of the 21st century. He thought the $75 million price tag was too high. He thought he was being smart. He thought he was holding the line. But the most expensive things in life aren't the checks you write. They are the checks you refuse to sign. MySpace is gone. It is a digital graveyard, a punchline for a generation that doesn't even remember using it. But Facebook remains, a monument to the power of knowing exactly what you are worth. The next time you haggle over the price of the future, make sure you aren't blinking over pennies.
September 2000, Dallas, Texas. It is one of those sweltering late summer days where the heat radiates off the asphalt like a physical weight. But on the 27th floor of the Renaissance Tower, the air is freezing. This is the headquarters of Blockbuster Video, the inner sanctum of the most powerful entertainment retailer on Earth. The carpets are plush, the walls are lined with movie posters, not the paper ones you get at the cinema, but pristine prints encased in gold and polished steel frames. Everything about this place screams old money, power, permanence. In the waiting room, 2 men are sitting on a leather sofa that probably cost more than their company's entire monthly marketing budget. They are out of place. They aren't wearing the custom-tailored Italian suits that dominate these hallways. They are wearing wrinkled chinos and polo shirts. They smell like economy class and anxiety. Their names are Reed Hastings and Mark Randolph. They are the founders of a tiny, chaotic startup called Netflix, and they are absolutely terrified. They aren't here to conquer the king. They are here to surrender. They are bleeding cash. Their investors are panicked. The dot-com bubble has just burst, wiping out trillions of dollars in wealth overnight, and Netflix is next on the chopping block. They have one play left, a Hail Mary pass. They're going to walk into that boardroom and ask John Antioco, the CEO of Blockbuster, a man known as a retail genius, to save them. They don't know it yet, but they are about to walk into the most expensive meeting in the history of American business. To understand the sheer absurdity of this meeting, you have to look at the numbers. In the year 2000, Blockbuster wasn't just a store. It was a ritual. They had 9,000 locations worldwide. They employed 60,000 people. A Blockbuster membership card was more common in American wallets than a library card. The revenue was nearly $6 billion a year. They were the blue and yellow ticket to Hollywood. And Netflix? Netflix was a disaster. They had about 300,000 subscribers, but the math wasn't working. Shipping DVDs back and forth through the mail was expensive. For every dollar they brought in, they were spending $2. They were on track to lose $57 million that year alone. They were burning through cash so fast that Hastings and Randolph had stopped sleeping. They were a gnat flying into the windshield of a semi-truck. But they had an idea, a partnership. The plan was simple. Blockbuster buys Netflix. Netflix becomes Blockbuster.com. Hastings and Randolph would run the online division, handling the messy logistics of the internet, while Blockbuster focused on what they were good at, running stores. It was a perfect marriage. Blockbuster had the brand, Netflix had the tech. But as the heavy mahogany door swung open and the secretary ushered them in, Reed Hastings felt a knot in his stomach. The room was cavernous.
The table was made of glass and wood, long enough to land a plane on. And at the head of that table sat John Antioco. Antioco was a legend. He had turned around Circle K. He had saved Taco Bell. He was a brick-and-mortar guy, a general of retail. He didn't look at Hastings and Randolph with curiosity. He looked at them with the polite boredom of a man who has far more important things to do, like planning his next yacht trip or counting his stock options. He waved them to their seats. The execution had begun. The meeting starts, and Mark Randolph takes the lead. He's the salesman. He leans in, trying to project confidence he doesn't feel. He walks them through the vision. The future is online, he says. People love movies, but they hate the drive. They hate the out-of-stock signs. Let us handle the back end. You guys keep the stores. We will rebrand our entire company to Blockbuster Online. It's a brilliant pitch. It solves Blockbuster's biggest weakness. They had zero presence on the web. But when Randolph said, "We can help you transition to a subscription model," what John Antioco heard was, "We can help you delete $800 million of pure profit from your balance sheet." The pitch winds down. The room goes silent. The air conditioning hums. John Antioco leans forward. He puts his elbows on the table. He looks Reed Hastings dead in the eye. "Okay, it's an interesting idea, but if we were to buy you, what are we talking? What's the number?" This is it. The moment that splits the timeline of history. Reed Hastings knows the number is high. Netflix is worth maybe half of it on paper. But he needs the cash to pay off the investors. He needs a win. He clears his throat. $50 million. For a second, nobody moves. And then John Antioco smiles. It's not a warm smile. It's the smile a parent gives a toddler who just said they want to be an astronaut. The general counsel, Ed Stead, doesn't even try to hide it. He lets out a chuckle. Then Antioco delivers the verdict. He doesn't negotiate. He doesn't counteroffer at $30 million. He doesn't say, "Let me check with the board." He simply says, "The dot-com hysteria is completely overblown. The internet is a fad." He pauses, letting the words hang in the freezing air. They were laughed out of the room. The meeting lasted less than an hour. Blockbuster essentially told them, "Go play with your little website. The adults are talking." Blockbuster missed the deal of the century because they ignored the data staring them in the face. Don't make the same mistake with your own time and money. Now back to the flight home. On the flight back to California, the shame in the cabin was palpable. They had just been humiliated by the biggest player in the game. They had spent thousands of dollars on a private plane they couldn't afford just to be told they were worthless. Mark Randolph recalls looking over at Reed Hastings. He expected to see a broken man. Instead, he saw a man plotting a murder. "Well, shit, they don't want us," Randolph said. Hastings turned to him, his eyes hard. "No, they don't. So now we're going to have to kick their ass." That laughter in the boardroom, it became the fuel for everything that followed. They landed in California and went to war. They stopped trying to sell the company and started trying to build a monster. The algorithm. They doubled down on their recommendation engine. If they couldn't carry every movie like Blockbuster, they would use code to convince you to watch the movies they did have. The queue. They made the addiction digital. You always had a movie waiting. And the pivot. And years later, when streaming technology finally caught up, they didn't hesitate. They burned their own DVD business to the ground to build the streaming platform. Why? Because they remembered what Antioco said. The internet is a fan. They bet their lives that he was wrong. It took 10 years for the joke to stop being funny. By 2004, Antioco realized his mistake. He tried to launch Blockbuster Online. He even tried to kill the late fees. But it was too little too late. The board fired him. Then came 2008, the financial crisis, and then the death blow. Streaming. While Blockbuster was arguing with landlords about rent for their 9,000 stores, Netflix was beaming movies directly onto PlayStations and iPads. Blockbuster was anchored to the physical world. Netflix was in the cloud. In 2010,
Exactly 10 years after that meeting, Blockbuster filed for bankruptcy. They had $900 million in debt. Their stock, which traded at $30 a share, was delisted. The blue and yellow signs were ripped down from strip malls across America, leaving ghostly outlines on the brick. And Netflix? Today, Netflix is worth over $250 billion. They don't just rent movies, they are Hollywood. They win Oscars. They define culture. There is one Blockbuster left, just one, in Bend, Oregon. It sits there like a gravestone, a monument to arrogance. John Antioco isn't a villain. He was a smart man, a successful executive. But he made the classic mistake of the powerful. He fell in love with his own success. He thought the way the world was the way it would always be. $50 million. That's the cost of a mid-budget rom-com. For that price, Blockbuster could have owned the future. Instead, they bought their own extinction. The next time you open Netflix and hear that ba-doom sound, remember the boardroom in Dallas, remember the cold air, and remember the laughter. Because in the end, history doesn't care about your quarterly earnings. It only cares about who saw the future coming and who blinked.
It is 1998. If you are too young to remember this time, you have to understand one thing. The internet wasn't a utility, it was a destination. It was slow, it was loud, and it was incredibly difficult to navigate. There was no feed, there was no algorithm. To find anything, you didn't search, you browsed. You clicked through human-made directories. Business, markets, technology, computers. It was like looking up a phone number in a physical book the size of a skyscraper. And the librarian of this chaotic library, the king of the .com world, was Yahoo. Yahoo wasn't just a website. In 1998, Yahoo was the internet. They were the portal. They were the front door. Their headquarters in Santa Clara was a playground for the new rich. The stock price was vertical. They were painting the town purple. Their founders, Jerry Yang and David Filo, were the rock stars of the new economy. They believed that the internet was a media business, like a newspaper or a TV station. They hired hundreds of actual humans to surf the web and categorize websites into lists. They believed that humans would always curate the web. But 30 minutes down the road, in a dorm room at Stanford University, two PhD students were proving them wrong. Larry Page and Sergey Brin were not rock stars. They were academics. They were socially awkward math nerds. Their dorm room looked like a fire hazard. There were cables snaking across the floor. The air hummed with the heat of processors. And because they were broke students who couldn't afford proper server cases, they had built a custom housing for their 10 4-gigabyte hard drives using the only material they had lying around: Lego bricks. Blue, yellow, red, and green bricks holding together the future of human knowledge. They had built a search algorithm called Backrub. It was brilliant. Every other search engine at the time looked at the words on a page. If you searched for cars, it looked for the page that said cars the most times. Larry and Sergey's code was different. It counted how many other pages linked to a site. It treated the internet like a popularity contest. It was precise, it was ruthless, and it was fast. But here's the twist. They didn't want it. Larry and Sergey didn't want to run a company. They wanted to finish their PhDs. They wanted to become professors. Backrub was a nuisance. It was eating up all of Stanford's bandwidth. The IT department was threatening to kick them off the network. It was a distraction from their real work. So they made a rational decision. They would sell the technology to someone who cared, pocket some cash to pay off their student loans, and get back to studying. They put on their best wrinkled shirts, they drove to Santa Clara, and they set up a meeting with the king. The meeting takes place in Yahoo's executive offices. The contrast is painful. On one side, you have the Yahoo team, confident, wealthy, riding the biggest wave in history. On the other side, two students who smell like soldering ringer and anxiety. Larry and Sergey make the pitch. This is the PageRank system, they explain. It finds exactly what the user is looking for, instantly, It is mathematically superior to your human directories. Then they name their price. $1 million. $1 million for the source code that will eventually become Google, for the algorithm that will map the physical world, index every book ever written, and answer every question ever asked. They are offering it for the price of a modest house in the Bay Area. David Philo, one of Yahoo's founders, actually liked the guys. He respected the math. He saw that the tech worked, but he looked at them and shook his head. No. Why? They didn't say no because the price was too high. Yahoo had money to burn. They didn't say no because the tech was bad. They said no because of a philosophy. A philosophy that sounds insane today, but was the gospel in 1998. Stickiness. One executive explained the problem to Page and Brin. Your search engine is too good. If a user comes to Yahoo and types in cancer treatment, your engine finds the answer instantly. And then what happens? The user clicks the link and they leave Yahoo. Do you see the logic? Yahoo was an ad-supported business. They got paid for every minute you stared at their page. They didn't want to send you to the answer. They wanted you to keep browsing. They wanted you to check your email, read the horoscope, play a game, and look at the stock ticker. To Yahoo, a confused user was a profitable user. A user who found what they wanted was a lost customer. They told the future trillionaires, search is just a commodity. It's a utility. It's a feature, not a business. Philo told them, go build the company yourselves. When it grows up, come back and see us. Dejected, Larry and Sergey walked out of the office. They couldn't sell the thing. So, forced by rejection, they went to a garage in Menlo Park. They incorporated. They changed the name from Backrub to Google. And they leaned into the very thing Yahoo hated. While Yahoo's homepage became a crowded Times Square billboard, flashing lights, news tickers, clutter, Google launched a page that was white. Just the logo and the box. They made a bet that Yahoo couldn't understand. If you let people leave, they will come back. Yahoo ignored the data because they were in love with their model. Don't fall in love with a failing strategy. Now back to the decline. Fast forward just 4 years. 2002. The dot-com bubble has burst. The portals are dying, but Google is growing like a weed. Yahoo realizes they made a mistake. They call Google back. This time, the price isn't $1 million. Google asks for $5 billion. The CEO of Yahoo is now Terry Semel. He's an old-school Hollywood guy from Warner Bros. He doesn't understand code, he understands movies. He looks at Google and sees a one-trick pony. He negotiates, he haggles. He offers $3 billion. Google holds firm at $5 billion. Terry Semel thinks no one is worth that much money. He refuses to bridge the gap. The deal falls apart over $2 billion. Now, you might think, well, $2 billion is a lot of money, but let me give you some context on how Yahoo spent its cash. 3 years earlier, in 1999, Yahoo spent $5.7 billion to buy a company called Broadcast.com. It was an internet radio service founded by Mark Cuban. It had barely any revenue, it had no proprietary tech. They bought it, and within a few years, they shut it down. They lit $5.7 billion on fire for a radio station that didn't work, but they wouldn't pay $5 billion for Google. They walked the lay again. They decided to buy a cheaper search engine called Inktomi and try to build their own Google. They failed. The years passed. The walled garden crumbled. Users didn't want to be trapped. They wanted speed. Yahoo became a ghost town, a relic, a place where your grandparents have an email address they never check. But the red ink wasn't done flowing. In 2008, Microsoft saw that Yahoo was bleeding and offered to buy them. Steve Ballmer offered $44.6 billion, and Yahoo said no. Jerry Yang, the founder, refused to sell. He believed the company was worth more. He fought off the acquisition. He thought he could turn it around. So let's recap the scorecard of Yahoo's leadership. Refused to buy Google for $1 billion, refused to buy Google for $5 billion, refused to buy Facebook for $1 billion, yes, that happened too, refused to sell themselves for $45 billion. It is a masterclass in getting it wrong every single time. In 2017, the end finally came. Yahoo, the company that once ruled the world, the company that was the internet, was sold to Verizon. They sold for $4.48 billion. That is roughly 10% of what Microsoft offered them, and it is a rounding error compared to Google. Today, Alphabet, Google's parent company, is worth over $2 trillion. They didn't just build a search engine, they built the operating system of the planet. Android, Maps, YouTube, Gmail, the cloud. Let's look at the map of that first meeting one last time. $1 million. If Yahoo had spent that money in 1998, it would have been the greatest investment in the history of capitalism. Instead, they saved the $1 million to protect a business model that was designed to annoy their own customers. They fell into the classic trap of the incumbent, protectionism. They tried to protect their views instead of improving the user's life. Yahoo tried to be a jailer. Google offered a key. And the world always chooses the key. The next time you see that simple, multicolored G on your screen, remember the 2 PhD students who just wanted to get back to their homework. Remember the Lego bricks. And remember the executives in the nice suits who thought they were too smart to fix their own product. For millions of people, that sound is the definition of childhood. It is the sound of Final Fantasy, of Tony Hawk, of a new era of entertainment. But inside the boardrooms of Kyoto, Japan, that sound is something else entirely. It is the sound of a mistake, a $50 billion mistake. In the early 1990s, Nintendo wasn't just a gaming company. They were a sovereign state. They controlled 90% of the global market. They had more cash reserves than major automobile manufacturers. They were untouchable. But empires don't usually fall because of an invading army. They fall because of arrogance. They fall because they believe they are too big to fail. This is the story of how Nintendo, in a paranoid attempt to protect their monopoly, accidentally handed the keys to the kingdom to their biggest rival. This isn't just a console war. This is a story about betrayal, revenge, and the most expensive contract dispute in history. Welcome to Red Ink History. To understand the betrayal, you have to understand the tyrant. Hiroshi Yamauchi. Yamauchi didn't play video games. He reportedly hated them. He was a businessman who inherited a playing card company and turned it into a global superpower through fear and absolute control. By 1990, Nintendo operated less like a toy company and more like a cartel. They used a system called the lockout chip. If you were a developer like Konami, Capcom, or EA, and you wanted to sell a game on the NES, you had to play by Yamauchi's rules. Rule 1. Nintendo manufactures every cartridge. You can't make your own. Rule 2. You pay Nintendo up front. Even if the game doesn't sell, Nintendo keeps the money. Rule 3. Exclusivity. If you release a game on the NES, you cannot release it on a Sega console for 2 years. It was a license to print money, but it bred resentment. Developers felt like serfs working for a feudal lord. Even retailers hated them. Nintendo would artificially limit supply to create hype, leaving stores with angry customers and empty shelves. Everyone, from the coders to the shop clerks, was praying for Nintendo's downfall. They just needed a weapon. That weapon was the CD-ROM. The industry was shifting. Cartridges were expensive to make, costing about $30 per unit to manufacture. They had tiny storage space. CD-ROMs, they cost $1 to print, and they held massive amounts of data. Full motion video, orchestral music, voice acting. But Yamauchi was terrified of CDs. Why? Because CDs are easy to copy. He feared piracy would destroy his iron grip on the market. However, he couldn't ignore the future. He needed a partner, someone to build a bridge to this new technology, but someone he could control. Enter Sony. Sony in the late 80s was the Apple of its day. They made high-end electronics. they did not make toys. Within Sony, a young engineer named Ken Kutaragi was an outcast. He loved video games. His bosses hated them. Kutaragi had to work in secret. He literally hid his involvement with Nintendo from his own superiors, building the sound chip for the Super Nintendo at night. When his bosses found out, they almost fired him. But the CEO, Norio Oga, saw a spark. He let Kutaragi proceed. In 1988, a deal was struck, a marriage of convenience. Sony would build a CD-ROM add-on for the Super Nintendo. It was to be called the PlayStation. And this is where the red ink begins to spill. Nintendo, usually so shark-like in negotiations, made a fatal error. They didn't read the fine print closely enough. Kutaragi, desperate to prove Sony's worth and secure his own job, had inserted a specific clause. The contract stated that while Nintendo owned the cartridge games, Sony would retain the rights to the CD-ROM format. This meant Sony could license movies, music, and crucially, video games on CD without paying Nintendo a single cent. When Minoru Arakawa and Howard Lincoln, the heads of Nintendo America, finally deciphered this contract, they turned pale. They realized this wasn't a partnership, it was a Trojan horse. If this console launched, Sony would control the disc manufacturing. They would control the licensing. They would slowly strangle Nintendo's cartridge business and take over the industry from the inside. They flew to Kyoto immediately. They stormed into Yamauchi's office. They told him, if we let this happen, we are creating our own replacement. We will be working for Sony in 5 years. Yamauchi didn't get angry, he got even. He sent Howard Lincoln to Europe, specifically to the headquarters of Sony's biggest rival, Philips. June 1991, the Consumer Electronics Show in Chicago, the biggest tech stage on Earth. On day one, Sony is triumphant. They announced the PlayStation partnership with Nintendo. The press cheers. Sony executives pop the champagne. Olaf Olafsson, the head of Sony America, goes to sleep that night thinking he has secured the future of the company. But he didn't know that Howard Lincoln was waiting in the wings. The next morning, 9 a.m., the Nintendo press conference. The room is packed. Sony executives are sitting in the front row. They're smiling. They expect Nintendo to hype up the partnership. Howard Lincoln walks to the podium. He adjusts the microphone. He looks at the crowd. He doesn't mention Sony. Instead, he says, Nintendo is pleased to announce that we have partnered with Philips to develop a CD-ROM drive for the Super Nintendo. Silence. Then, chaos. Reporters are scrambling to find phones. Sony executives are looking at each other, faces draining of color. It wasn't just a business pivot, it was a public execution. Nintendo had left Sony at the altar in front of the entire world. The betrayal was absolute, and to add insult to injury, the deal with Philips was a disaster. It produced nothing but failure, including the infamous CDI console and the worst Zelda games ever made. But Nintendo didn't actually care about Philips. They just wanted to kill the Sony deal. They calculated that Sony, embarrassed, defeated, and with no gaming experience, would pack up their toys and go home. It was a calculated risk, and mathematically it made sense. But they forgot one thing, the human element. They forgot about the rage of Ken Kutaragi and the pride of Norio Oga. Back in Tokyo, the mood was funereal. The Sony board of directors wanted to kill the project immediately. They said, "We are a serious company. Why are we chasing after Nintendo? They humiliated us. Let's cut our losses and go back to making stereos." Ken Kutaragi was about to lose his life's work. He had one card left to play. He requested a meeting with Norio Oga, the president of Sony. The meeting took place after a long executive dinner. Tensions were high. Kutaragi didn't talk about profits. He didn't talk about market share. he appealed to Oga's samurai spirit. He looked the president in the eye and said, "Are you going to just accept what Nintendo did to us? Are we going to let them get away with this humiliation?" Oga slammed his fist on the table. "Do it," he shouted, "build it and crush them." That fist slam was the moment the PlayStation was truly born. Sony went to war, but Kutaragi knew they couldn't beat Nintendo at their game. They couldn't make a better Mario. Nintendo had 20 years of experience making games. Sony had 0. So they decided to change the battlefield. Strategy 1, the technology. Nintendo was betting on 2D sprites. They thought 3D was a gimmick. Sony bet the farm on 3D polygons. They wanted games to look like movies. Strategy 2, the developers. While Nintendo was still bullying developers with high cartridge fees and strict censorship, Sony rolled out the red carpet. They offered cheap CD manufacturing. They offered creative freedom. They went to the developers and said, "Nintendo treats you like servants. We will treat you like partners." The turning point came with Squaresoft. Square had been Nintendo's loyal ally for a decade, but they wanted to make Final Fantasy VII, a massive cinematic epic. Nintendo told them, put it on a cartridge. Square did the math. The game would require 13 cartridges. It was impossible. Sony offered them a CD. When Square defected to PlayStation, it sent a shockwave through the industry. The king had lost his strongest knight. Strategy 3, the culture. Nintendo marketed to kids. Sony marketed to you. They hired wipeout artists and club DJs. They put PlayStations in nightclubs. They made gaming cool. While Nintendo was still focused on colorful mascots, Sony introduced Crash Bandicoot, who literally stood in a parking lot with a megaphone yelling at Nintendo's headquarters in their commercials. But the war was ultimately decided by one number. May 19, 1995, the first Electronic Entertainment Expo, E3. Sega, desperate to stay relevant, announced their new console, the Saturn. They panicked and launched it early. They announced the price, $399. It was expensive. The crowd groaned. Then Steve Race, the head of PlayStation America, walked up to the podium. He carried a stack of papers. He looked like he was about to give a 30-minute keynote speech. He shuffled the papers. He leaned into the mic. $299. And he walked off. The room erupted. It is widely considered the greatest mic drop in corporate history. With one word and a $100 price difference, Sony obliterated the competition. The result was a massacre. Nintendo finally released the N64 a year later. It was a powerful machine, but they stuck to cartridges. Cartridges cost $30 to make. CDs cost $1. Third-party developers abandoned Nintendo in droves. They couldn't afford the red ink. The PlayStation went on to sell over 102 million units. The Nintendo 64 sold just 32 million. For the first time in history, Nintendo was not the king of gaming. They had been dethroned by the very machine they commissioned. Today, the gaming landscape is different. Nintendo retreated into a blue ocean, focusing on innovation and family fun with the Switch, creating a market where they have no competition. Sony dominates the high-performance market, but the scars of 1991 remain. The story of the PlayStation is a masterclass in the law of unintended consequences. Nintendo tried to keep 100% of the pie, and in doing so, they lost the bakery. They proved that in business, your most dangerous enemy isn't the one across the street, it's the partner you betray across the table. This has been Red Ink History. If you enjoyed this deep dive, we are working on a documentary about the collapse of Sega, a company that had everything and lost it all. Enron wasn't losing money, it just wasn't making any either. But on paper, it was the most profitable company in America. In the year 2000, Enron was the seventh largest corporation in the United States. It was voted America's most innovative company 6 years in a row. It controlled the power grid, the gas lines, and the broadband networks. If you lived in America in the 90s, Enron wasn't just a business, it was a miracle. But miracles don't exist on Wall Street. In just 24 days, a company worth $60 billion evaporated. There was no foreign invasion, no terrorist attack, no market crash. Enron died because of a lie so complex it took thousands of people to tell it and only a handful to understand it. To understand the fraud, you have to understand the boredom. Before the private jets and the strip clubs, Enron was boring. It was a natural gas pipeline company. They owned pipes, they moved gas, they collected fees. It was safe, it was profitable, and for Ken Lay, the founder, it wasn't enough. Ken Lay was a man who wanted to be Secretary of Commerce. He collected politicians like baseball cards. But to fuel his political ambitions, he needed his stock price to soar. And pipelines don't soar. Pipelines rust. He needed a new vision. He found it in a consultant from McKinsey named Jeffrey Skilling. If Ken Lay was the face of Enron, Jeff Skilling was the brain. Skilling looked at the company's physical assets, the trucks, the pipelines, the plants, and he sneered. He told Lay, cut the pipes. He argued that the real money wasn't in delivering gas, it was in trading it. Skilling wanted to turn Enron into a gas bank, a stock market for energy. It was a radical idea, and it worked. Suddenly, Enron wasn't a utility company, it was a logistics company, a hedge fund disguised as a gas company. But Skilling had one condition for joining Enron full-time. He demanded they change the accounting system. He wanted to use something called mark-to-market accounting. This is the moment the bomb was planted. We need to stop and explain mark-to-market accounting, because without this, there is no Enron. In traditional accounting, if you signed a 10-year deal to supply gas, you book the profit each year as the cash actually hits your bank account. You make $1, you write down $1. Simple. Jeff Skilling's mark-to-market was different. Under this rule, if Enron signed a 10-year deal today, they could estimate the total profit that deal might make over the next decade and book it all today. Think about that. Imagine you open a lemonade stand. You haven't sold a single cup, but you project that over the next 10 years, you will sell 1 million cups. So on day one, you tell the bank, I made $1 million today. The bank says, show me the cash. And you say, I don't have the cash, but I have the idea. This allowed Enron to become a time machine. They were stealing profits from the future to make the present look rich. But there was a catch. If you book 10 years of profit today, what do you do next year? To keep the stock price up, you have to do a bigger deal, and then a bigger one. It is a beast that is never full. Take the Blockbuster deal. Enron partnered with Blockbuster to stream movies. The technology didn't work. Blockbuster walked away. But Enron, they had already used mark-to-market to estimate the partnership was worth $110 million. They booked a $110 million profit on a deal that generated $0. Jeff Skilling was hailed as a genius. But inside the building, the panic was setting in. Because while the accounting book showed billions in profit, the bank accounts were empty. You can't pay salaries with future theoretical earnings. You need cash. Enron was bleeding cash. They needed a way to hide the blood. Enter Andrew Fastow, the CFO. If Skilling was the visionary, Fastow was the plumber. He was the guy who made the toilets flush when the pipes were clogged with debt. Fastow created a network of special purpose entities. Think of them as invisible backpacks. Here's the shell game. Enron has a failing asset, maybe a power plant in India that's losing millions. If they keep it, their stock drops. So Fastow creates a fake company. Let's call it Raptor. Enron sells the failing power plant to Raptor. Suddenly, Enron has sold an asset. They book a profit. The debt is gone. But who owns Raptor? Enron does.
It was Enron selling things to itself, using money borrowed from banks, guaranteed by Enron stock. It was a circle of insanity.
Fasto created hundreds of these companies: Jedi, Chuco, LJM. He hid $30 billion of debt in these ghost companies. And the worst part, Fasto wasn't doing this for free. He set up these deals so that he personally took a cut. He stole $45 million from his own company while he was hiding its losses. The board of directors approved it. The lawyers approved it. The auditors, Arthur Andersen, stamped it. Everyone was making too much money to ask if it was real. By the year 2000, the fraud had to grow to stay alive. They turned their eyes to California. The state had just deregulated its electricity market. Enron's traders saw fresh meat. They realized they could manipulate the power grid to spike prices. On recorded phone lines, Enron traders were heard telling power plant operators to find a little bit of trouble with the plants and just shut them down. Their motto was simple: burn, baby, burn. They engineered blackouts. They forced power plants to shut down in the middle of summer. When the lights went out, the price of electricity skyrocketed. Enron made $2 billion from the California crisis. When asked about the suffering in California, Jeff Skilling joked, "The difference between the Titanic and California is that the Titanic had the lights on when it went down. The hubris had reached a boiling point. The gods were about to strike back." August 1st, 2001. The music slows down. The dot-com bubble has burst. The economy is cooling, and Enron's stock price begins to wobble. Remember those shell companies? They were backed by Enron stock. If the stock price fell below a certain line, the shell companies would crash. And if they crashed, all that hidden debt would flood back onto Enron's books instantly. Sharon Watkins, a vice president, saw the math. She wrote an anonymous memo to Ken Lay. She wrote, "I am incredibly nervous that we will implode in a wave of accounting scandals." Lay thanked her, and then he asked his lawyers if he could fire her. On August 14th, the captain jumped ship. Jeff Skilling, the architect, suddenly resigned. He cited personal reasons. Wall Street panicked. If the genius is leaving, what does he know? The pressure mounted. On an earnings call, an analyst asked Skilling why Enron couldn't produce a straightforward balance sheet. Skilling, stressed and arrogant, leaned into the microphone and called the analyst an asshole. That one word was the sound of the facade cracking. By October, the losses were announced: $600 million, then $1.2 billion. The shell companies collapsed. The debt came home. As the ship sank, Ken Lay told employees to buy the stock. He told them the company was stronger than ever. At the same time, executives were quietly selling $1 billion worth of their own shares. On December 2nd, 2001, Enron filed for bankruptcy. The smartest guys in the room had locked the doors and set the building on fire. 20,000 people lost their jobs. $2 billion in pension plans, retirement savings for secretaries, linemen, janitors was wiped out. They got nothing. Andy Fasto pled guilty. He served 6 years. Jeff Skilling was sentenced to 24 years. Kenneth Lay was convicted on all counts, but 3 months before his sentencing, while on vacation in Aspen, his heart howled out. He died before he spent a day in prison. Enron changed everything. It destroyed Arthur Andersen, one of the oldest accounting firms in the world. It birthed the Sarbanes-Oxley Act to police corporate fraud. But ask yourself, has it really changed? Every time you hear about a tech startup valued at billions despite making zero profit, every time you see adjusted EBITDA instead of real earnings, you're seeing the ghosts of Enron. They say numbers don't lie, but the people who write the numbers do. Enron proved that if you tell a lie big enough and profitable enough, the whole world will play along.
Wait, what? Real blood? Fake results? Billionaires funded it, generals endorsed it, no one checked if it worked, and people paid the price. This was Theranos. In Silicon Valley, there is a golden rule: fake it until you make it. It works for software. If your app crashes, you patch it. If your website's slow, you fix the code while the users sleep. But biology is different. You cannot patch a human vein.
You cannot debug a cancer diagnosis. In 2014, one company forgot this distinction. They were valued at $9 billion. They had a board of directors that included heavyweights like Henry Kissinger and General James Mattis. They were the darling of the tech world. Elizabeth Holmes was the youngest female self-made billionaire in history. She promised a device that looked like an iPhone but acted like a hospital. 1 drop of blood, 200 tests, instant results. She called it the Edison. But the device never worked. Not once. It was a box of lies, wire, and glue. And to keep that box closed, Elizabeth Holmes would ruin lives, burn through hundreds of millions of dollars, and risk the health of thousands of real patients. This is red ink history. The year is 2003. A 19-year-old chemical engineering student named Elizabeth Holmes drops out of Stanford. She has a fear of needles, and she has an idea. She pitches a wearable patch that can scan your blood for infection and instantly deliver antibiotics. Her professor, Phyllis Gardner, a renowned expert in medicine, tells her the truth. Elizabeth, that is physically impossible. You cannot get that kind of data from a tiny amount of blood, and you certainly can't fit a pharmacy into a patch. Most students would go back to the drawing board. Holmes went to the patent office. She incorporated Theranos, a combination of therapy and diagnosis. She didn't have the science, but she had something more dangerous: charisma. She began to craft a persona. She worshipped Apple. She hired the same marketing agency as Apple. She started wearing the Issey Miyake black turtlenecks, just like Steve Jobs. She even changed her blinking patterns, staring uncomfortably long to assert dominance. But her greatest special effect was her voice. Holmes naturally spoke in a higher, softer register, but she realized that in a boardroom full of older men, a young woman's voice might be dismissed. So she engineered a new one. Former employees recall her hearing her slip up after a few drinks or when she was excited, but in public she maintained a deep baritone growl. It was a psychological trick. It signaled authority. It signaled, I am not a girl, I am a CEO. And it worked. Rupert Murdoch, the Waltons, the Cox family, they poured in $700 million. They didn't invest in the science, they invested in the character. So what was the science? The premise was microfluidics, the idea that you could take a nanotainer, a vial the size of a pill, fill it with a drop of blood from a finger prick, and run panels for everything from cholesterol to syphilis. But here's why Professor Gardner said it was impossible. When you draw blood from a vein with a needle, the cells flow smoothly. When you prick a finger, you are smashing the capillaries. You are mixing blood with tissue fluid. The cells rupture. This is called hemolysis. It's a dirty sample. Furthermore, to run 200 tests, you need volume. Theranos didn't have enough blood, so they had to dilute the sample. Imagine trying to test the chlorine levels in a swimming pool by taking a cup of pool water and adding 10 gallons of tap water. The trace of chlorine is gone. The data is noise. The engineers knew this. Inside the lab, the Edison machines were a nightmare. They were small, so they overheated. The robotic arms jammed. The centrifuges exploded, spraying blood and glass inside the machine. It was a biohazard in a box. But Holmes demanded perfection. When investors came to visit, Theranos staged the demos. They would prick the investor's finger, put the blood in the box would make whirring noises, but the screen wasn't showing data, it was showing a pre-recorded animation that said processing.
The machine was dead. The confidence was the only thing that was real. If this had stayed in a research lab, it would have been a sad story of a failed startup. But in 2013, Holmes committed the act that turned a lie into a crime. She signed a deal with Walgreens. She rolled these machines out to real stores, real people. Arizona, California. People walked in thinking they were getting state-of-the-art medical care. But since the Edison didn't work, Theranos had to cheat. Every day, couriers would pick up the blood samples from Walgreens and drive them to Theranos HQ. They didn't go to the room with the Edisons. They went to a secret lab, a lab that inspectors weren't allowed to see. They called it Normandy. Inside Normandy, lined up in rows, were commercial blood analyzers made by Siemens, the same machines Quest Diagnostics and hospitals used. Theranos was secretly buying third-party machines and using them to run the tests. But there was a catch. The Siemens machines were designed for large vials of venous blood. Theranos only had the tiny nanotainers from the finger prick. So they hacked the machines. They diluted the tiny samples to make the volume larger. This voided the warranty. It confused the sensors. It ruined the accuracy. But it gave them a number. And that's all Holmes wanted, a number to print on a sheet of paper. The results were catastrophic. One patient was told she was miscarrying her child. She wasn't. Another was told he had HIV. He didn't. A cancer survivor was told her markers were shooting up, that the cancer was back. She spent weeks planning her own funeral, terrified, until a real doctor at a real hospital told her she was perfectly healthy. Theranos wasn't just stealing money anymore. They were stealing peace of mind. They were stealing time. Why didn't anyone speak up? Enter Ramesh Sunny Balwani, Elizabeth's secret boyfriend and the company's OOO. If Elizabeth was the face, Sunny was the muscle. He created a culture of absolute terror. IT teams monitored employee emails. Keyloggers tracked what they typed. Scientists were segregated. Teams weren't allowed to talk to each other, so no one could figure out the full picture. And if you quit, or if you asked too many questions, you were threatened. Tyler Schultz was 22 years old. He was the grandson of George Schultz, the former Secretary of State who sat on the Theranos board. Tyler saw the QC tests failing. He saw the data being deleted. When he tried to tell his grandfather, George refused to believe him. Elizabeth had charmed the old statesman so thoroughly that he trusted her over his own flesh and blood. Tyler and another young colleague, Erica Chung, became whistleblowers. Holmes and Balwani unleashed the lawyers. Private investigators followed them. They camped outside their houses. They threatened to bankrupt their families. Tyler's parents had to mortgage their house to pay for his legal defense. The cost of telling the truth was nearly $500,000. But the truth has a way of bleeding out. Investigative reporter John Carreyrou of the Wall Street Journal got the tip. He spent months digging, interviewing ex-employees, and dodging threats from Theranos lawyers. In October 2015, he published the bombshell. Theranos struggles with its blood technology. Holmes went on television. She smiled. She lied. She called the report a conspiracy. But the regulators, the FDA and CMS, finally walked in the front door. They inspected the lab. They found the secret Siemens machines. They found the temperature failures. They declared the lab an immediate jeopardy to patient health. The house of cards collapsed. Walgreens sued. The investors sued. The government brought criminal charges. The $9 billion valuation evaporated into thin air. The black turtlenecks were packed away. In January 2022, a jury found Elizabeth Holmes guilty on 4 counts of defrauding investors. She blamed Sunny. She claimed she didn't know. She tried to use her new role as a mother to gain sympathy. But the judge sentenced her to more than 11 years in federal prison. Silicon Valley will always love a good story. They love the dropout genius who sees the future. But Theranos proved that there is a line between vision and fraud. You can fake a keynote speech. You can fake a deep voice. You can even fake a balance sheet for a while. But you cannot fake the blood. Red Ink history tells the stories behind the numbers, the deals that failed, the lies that worked, and the moments that changed everything. Subscribe for the stories history tried to erase.